The creatures of Monster Hunter don't exist in a vacuum. From the beginning of the series, they were intended to be smaller pieces in a broader natural world, like an exaggerated form of our own. As such, they needed places to live, and even on the PS2, the assorted maps made for them presented a stunning look at the surrounding world. But maps aren't just arenas. They're an underrated part of the whole process. Monsters are often designed with them in mind and vice versa. So let's explore how monsters and maps intersect with one another. Much of the initial ideas that were later heavily expanded upon were already present in some way in the earlier games, and monsters have 3 points of contact present at various levels of relevance. Interactions with the hunter, which forms the core gameplay loop, interactions with the map for either gameplay or aesthetic purposes, and interactions with other monsters outside of just accidental attacks from being in the same area. There's no shortage of content talking about Monster Hunter's combat in general, so this video will deal much more with the other 2 points. And even in the earliest game, we can see the skeleton of some of these ideas. The dromes, Velocidrome, Gendrome and Iodrome, would summon smaller raptors to assist them in dealing with the hunter, which is a rudimentary form of monster interaction, as the canonical social bonds of the species are used to change the hunt. It's very basic, and monster-monster interactions wouldn't get much more developed until later, but it's an early start in things. But it's clear some monsters and environments were created in tandem with one another. And whilst this also becomes more prevalent in later games, Kezu and the Bloss Wyverns start off as fairly strong examples of this. Kezu's fight doesn't have to involve the ceiling. In fact, if you're not a feckless coward and use a melee weapon as God intended, then you can't even damage him on there. But he can still use it to stalk the player, either leaping onto them or dripping acidic saliva. It's a big advantage specifically for the monster over the hunter. In the dark caves with no music but heavy ambience and the Kezu's laboured shuffling, it all results in environmental interaction creating an atmospheric fight. Kezu was given caves in both the swamp and jungle where it could be fought, and these also facilitated its attacks, with wet floors to better conduct electricity as per the initial ideas in the concept art. This was dropped as early as 2nd gen, and now Kezu just sort of goes wherever. But it's clear it initially had a lot of focus with where it lived influencing its fight. Similarly, the Bloss Wyverns presented one of the bigger challenges of the game, being large and powerful monsters with no flight capabilities but burrowing instead. Their use of the ground is a fairly obvious example of such an interaction, and has become so normalised, both in terms of the Bloss Wyverns specifically, but also having a few other burrowing monsters, that it doesn't feel relevant. But in the all-Wyvern roster, it was a successful way of separating the Blosses from others. There was also ledging, where an environmental interaction benefited the hunter due to the monster's nature and morphology, and this provided some balance to the powerful desert tyrants that provided a solid challenge. Unlike Kezu, both of these traits have stuck with the Bloss Wyverns since their conception, as has their habitat fidelity. They're one of the few monsters to have remained in their initial biome. Monster Hunter DOS did as good sequels should, and expand on what was good. As such, it brought in more monsters, maps and weapons, and no longer used the right analog stick for combat. With this collection of new monsters, it brought some expansions of earlier themes. The 2 primates, Blangonga and Congalala, probably present the most significant embellishments. Congalala has effectively a rudimentary version of the stamina mechanic that would come later. At points in the fight, it sniffs out and consumes mushrooms in its jungle or swamp home. These give it either fire, poison, sleep or stun, which obviously makes the hunt more dangerous. But the hunter can still spin this to their advantage. 1. Congalala will eat other food, and so baited meat can be set out for it too. But also, mushroom picking is kind of a big deal in early game Monster Hunter. Or at least in the earlier games it was. It's very relevant for both healing and crafting items. Players should be familiar with at least some mushroom spots, and in the first game you're taught to follow mosswine to help you find them, so traps and bombs can be set at mushroom crops to turn the tables, giving an early example of monster behaviours in their environment being something of a double-edged sword. Depending on who does what, either the monster or the hunter can benefit. Blangonga, on the other hand, has a secondary addition to monster interactions, in that unlike the drones, it can actually lose command of its troop. If its teeth are broken with a fire weapon, it can no longer summon Blangos to its aid. Whilst the old drone calls could be interrupted, Blangonga's breakable parts can mean it out and out loses its authority in its own social unit. As a small step up to this, 2nd Gen also introduced something of an anomaly in low-rank Elder Dragons. In Freedom 2 and Unite, they could just be fought alongside Rathalos and Diablos as normal, only getting their loftier high-rank status later in the series. Elders stick out considerably compared to the other monsters, and whilst they've still retained the grounded focus, DOS's flagship, Kushala Daora, was shown to engage in standard biological behaviours like feeding and molting. Their broad map ranges and bigger focus on specific attack gimmicks gave them less connection with their environments. So it's not much of a surprise one of the most focused games in this regard had no regular low-level elders. Monster Hunter Tri. Tri had a huge emphasis on monster ecology and environmental interaction. First off, it introduced the stamina mechanic, that when monsters had fought for long enough, or especially if certain weapons were used on them, they would have to feed to replenish stamina. And so for this, every monster had to have its diet figured out in the course of its development. It'd be tempting for many to create a monotonous list of carnivores, but rather a suite of interesting lore and adaptations came just from this mechanic. This is where Diablos was first established as herbivorous in-game, for example, and was actually seen to eat cacti. As well, there was the insectivorous Baroth destroying Altaroth nests to feed. Kurapiko would fish, and Uragan treats itself to a hearty diet of rocks. Stamina bakes ecology into the gameplay, and forces monsters to interact with their environments one way or another to replenish it, in turn showcasing more of their behaviour organically. But monsters also interacted with the maps in other ways. Some, like Agnacta and Baroth, had armor and /or status effects that had to be replenished in the environment, in either mud or lava pools, and would change with time or certain weapon usage. As most chiefly, Tri's maps were purpose-built for its monsters. The volcano is made for Uragan and Agnacta, with the latter getting low ceilings it can chain burrowing moves in and out of, and the former getting special sloped sides in some areas for its Thunderdome rolling. Gobel gets a silty, low-visibility river with plenty of plant life for it to mimic when in the Benthos. The tundra has both walls and ceilings for Barioth and Giginox, so the former can launch itself off them for attacks, and so the latter can adapt Kezu's wall crawling and ceiling crawling abilities. The caves were also exceptionally dark, further emphasizing Giginox's dim glow and forcing the player to choose between illumination and weaponry, unless they went for sword and shield. The sandy plains, whilst being part desert, is really better described as an arid savanna map, and Baroth gets its mud wallow to roll and replenish in, and Altaroth nests to destroy. Whilst the sandy desert areas were made to facilitate Diablos, it also gets some rock formations it can destroy for aesthetics too. But some of the main cast aren't quite included in all of this, and some of the main monsters explore other aspects of gameplay in interesting ways. The starter monsters have no real environmental interaction, and as starter monsters, that's fine. They're literally there to just teach you how to give and take hits, how your weapon works, and how you use traps and bombs. Kurapiko is a significant advancement on monster-monster interactions, in that rather than calling its underlings of the same species, Kurapiko can call any species of large monster present, and then potentially buff them too. The player is rewarded for paying attention, as its body language shows whether it's summoning a large or small monster, as well as learning the calls of the individual monsters themselves. Kurapiko's breakable parts can also prevent this trait too. Outside of the stamina mechanic, Kurapiko doesn't get much environmental interaction, presumably as it was intended to play a large role in the free hunt mechanic of the Moga Woods, to keep things unpredictable. Finally, Deviljho is the first true invader of the series as an expansion of monster interactions with the player. Whilst earlier games could have non-target large monsters present, the unstable environment mechanic meant anything could show up, and Deviljho could appear in any map if unstable in high rank, whereupon it would pursue the player especially. So it understandably lacked much bespoke environmental interaction. so it could be slotted into this role and its key purpose of adding a memorable air of natural tension and unpredictability to high rank. Tri had a lot of issues that make it pretty understandable as to why it didn't sell that well, but it also significantly upped the ante on monster ecology, and had an incredibly characterful and memorable roster that make it still beloved to this day, warts and all. But Tri wasn't the only game in 3rd gen. Portable 3rd and 3 Ultimate brought with them several new monsters, like the Bear Trio, Nibelsnarf, Duramboros, Zinogre and Brachydios. This is where an early divide began with both the portable team's lessened focus on ecology, as well as those of the main game expansions. Many newcomers don't get as much to do as the Tri originals, but it could be worth noting Zinogre does stand out somewhat among the other monsters, in that the Misty Peaks is effectively his map. Despite having it near tailor-made for him, he gets no unique animations or environmental interactions with it. You could fight him anywhere really and it'd be the same. 4th gen's biggest changes were verticality and mounting, and understandably the maps changed heavily to support this, being covered in ledges and walls and slopes to give the player a near constant ability to mount the monster. In some later games this would become even more prevalent, and generally marked a mild shift from Tri into changing the maps to support the hunter as much as the monsters too. For returning monsters, some were adapted fairly seamlessly for this change like Kezu, but a lot of monsters needed work handling this new terrain. It seems Tigrex was used as something of a model organism in this regard per Fujioka's comments in the Iceborne book, and may well explain its prevalence in the early beta footage. New monsters like Tetsukabra and Zamtrios may have been given their pronounced froggy hops to help them deal with the maps as well. And like World, 4 and 4U are Leviathan-free games. From the known issues with Lagiacrus in World, it does seem some monsters just couldn't gel with the sloping ledged maps. Monsters do still get environmental interactions, but it's more focused on them generating something from the environment rather than them utilising something already there in the map. Tetsukabra and Yankutku are both examples of this, pulling boulders and Khonshu out of the ground respectively. Like a lot of 4 and 4U, it's something of a halfway point between Tri and later portable entries. Environmental interaction, but one with any habitat specificity removed, that the monsters can do anywhere. Some stick out though, like Nursilla and Ketchawacha. These early game monsters much more fit the older way, with more bespoke environments made for them. Both get plenty of environmental moves in the Ancestral Steppe and Sunken Hollow, with secondary platforms of vines or webs they can slip over and under but the hunter can't, that they can also potentially destroy, as well as some good aesthetics for them like the Gypsaros cocoons for Nursilla. She also gets a good few wall-mounted web moves too. On this note too, 4U also has perhaps the best pre-5th gen monster-monster interaction in Seltas Queen and her drones. Seltas already has a strong start as a great starter monster, but unlike others actually reclaims relevance by having an important and cinematic role in his queen's fight, serving to either replenish her stamina, assist in mobility, or be used as a disposable attack. It's an incredibly successful partnership from a gameplay perspective, and makes for an overall excellent fight. The main flagship and story-driving monsters of the game have little environmental involvement, but it's understandable why. In a similar way to Deviljho, and perhaps evolving the Invader trait to create the best story of the games, Gore does little in the maps themselves because he's meant to be fought across multiple ones, as its path crosses that of the hunters in the game's story. Its repeated appearance throughout the narrative and gameplay generally give it the strongest connection to the hunter of any flagship. Shagaru is for game purposes a different monster, but the one fought is the same individual simply molted into its adult form. So again, its chief role is to conclude Gore's doomed narrative with the hunter, in the final arena rather than a more typical environment. Seregios also have little environmental interaction, but then that's also sort of the point. They have nothing to do in the maps because it's not their home. They're a lost, displaced flock appearing where they shouldn't be, after they were driven out by the frenzied individual. So they fulfill the role of the invader in this game much like Deviljho, but uniquely as a one-time role in the overall games based purely on the story. 5th Gen obviously presented a huge shift in things with Monster Hunter World, with newly opened maps and further evolution of environmental behaviours. Now they no longer had to have purely practical uses. Monsters could just be monsters acting out their daily lives for the fun of it. Part of this likely comes from the loss of the CG shorts known as Monster Ecology or Life videos, having them replaced by monsters acting out such behaviours in-game. This was something of a gamble, with a lot of animations for something that didn't actually have a utilitarian payoff in the gameplay. But luckily it turned out to be a critically well-received feature of World, with a lot of people realising that watching monsters vibing out by themselves in their homes was an entertaining experience. Added to this was endemic life. Small animals found around the maps that could be collected for both fun and to decorate the player's home in Astera. Again, there's no strict purpose for this in-game. It's purely for fun, and to further embellish the maps and encourage their exploration. So obviously, giving the monsters a ton of such behaviours paid off. But what's the nitty-gritty behind the maps and their relationships to the monsters themselves? Well, World wasn't just a random grab bag of monsters, but rather a finely crafted experience with who went where and why. To start with the Ancient Forest, one of the chief goals starting out was that this map was the one they wanted to test on to see if they could make something that felt like a living ecosystem, as well as having a dense topography. The maze that is the Ancient Forest is entirely intentional, with the goal being to hide distant information and encourage taking detours, and to have exploration and experimentation. The Ancient Forest is the training ground in multiple senses, and the further the player gets into it, the bigger the challenge becomes, with the monsters getting more powerful the further you get from Astera. Not only is this to prevent the player getting ambushed on their front door, but to further add to the progression as you get deeper into things. Rathalos sits at the top of the map in his nest looking out from the giant tree, inspired from Takuda's visit to Torres del Paine's National Park in Chile, and seeing nesting condors at the highest point of the mountain. Great Jagras, Anjanath and the Wraths were the first 3 monsters created for the forest, and the ones most crucial to its growing development as an ecosystem. The developers wanted 3 visually distinct monsters leveling up in challenge and with equivalent interactions with each other, as per their place in the dominance hierarchy, as the player moves from a monster with 4 legs to 2 to something volant. Great Jagras is mauled by Anjanath in their turf war, as Anjanath is then deposed by Rathalos. All 3 have regular ecosystem interactions, and will descend to hunt Aptonoth on the coastal plain, with Great Jagras regurgitating the meat for its underlings back at the lair. Anjanath has a suite of behaviours as it suns itself on a hilltop, explores and marks its territory, and searches for other monsters to maul, also getting a stalking animation to do so. Other monsters like Tobi Kadachi and Puki Puki were added later. Puki was to teach the player about the environment, as it used it itself, eating nuts and berries to change its fight in the hope the player would get similar ideas with exploitable items. Tobi was to change up the tempo with a swift, early thunder monster, but was also made to utilise the treetops in a way other monsters hadn't done so in the forest so far. When all were combined, it made for a rich and distinct starting point to things that would set the tone for the rest of the maps. The Wildspire Waste was designed as the exact opposite of the Ancient Forest, with plentiful open environments to refresh the player after a maze of humid, lush vegetation. But with that said, the Wildspire has a layered history. Not originally conceived as the desert map, the Wildspire was more meant to be an open marsh with the anthills in them, and was to be the original home of Lagiacrus. As this failed to work, and Lagiacrus was presumably shifted to the Ancient Forest not long before he was booted out of the game, the swamp was drained and dried and became the desert map, with a small parcel of forest to show its close proximity to the Ancient Forest and Astera. With this in place, the Wildspire differentiates itself from the forest by changing its monster implementation too. Rather than the clear chain of power seen in the Ancient Forest, the Wildspire is almost like a prototype version of the 3 lords. Baroth, Joratodus and Rathian were meant to represent the desert, marsh and forest respectively, 3 squabbling claimants to the apex role trying to wrestle control from one another. Baroth and Joratodus especially for control of the marsh, With Lagarcrus gone, Joratodus was now styled as the new Lord of the Marsh, and he and Baroth were made to play off each other. As well as their turf war, Baroth's bulldozing can remove Joratodus's mud piles it creates. Baroth already had a strong environmental background, but was restored to true glory in World, after getting a single little sad mud puddle shoehorned in for its lackluster spin in Generations Ultimate. Part of the Wildspire was created with Baroth in mind from the beginning, with the desire for it to both demonstrate how to handle charging monsters, and for a monster that utilises the environment to enrich its fight. As such, the marsh is partially his, with it leaving to feed on the Wildspires by destroying them. With Baroth planned for the Wildspire before it became a lot less swampy, it could even be speculated Lagarcrus's animation killing Anjanath could have initially been for Baroth too. Luckily he dodged that bullet, only to stray into the path of another one in Diablos. Diablos represents itself as another success story. With a reasonably solid foundation with its simple fight and strong environmental use already, Diablos is best realised in Base World. Brought in as the new apex with the draining of the swamp, it stands above the squabbling wannabes, thrashing Baroth and Rathian respectively, with only Joratodus avoiding its ire in the muddy marsh. As well as still being legible, it can now destroy the Wildspires too, but chiefly it's the sole cause of the Fissure environmental trap, something not even Elders can achieve in the Dunes. A trap that can only be caused by a single monster ties it heavily to the environment, as well as showcasing its power. And in the final phase of its fight, Diablos also gets the Sand Curtain ambush in its nest for a final interactive spin on an old move. Overall, with its ability to damage both other monsters and the environment around it, Diablos has never been better realised as the giant wrecking ball of the desert it is, and showcases how old monsters can be reinvigorated with meticulous environmental detail. The Coral Highlands were made to be a vertical surprise for players after the Forest and Wildspire. Neither a jungle maze nor an open desert, but a series of coral towers, with the theme of the ocean but on land. The area is constantly blasted by powerful updrafts, intense gusts of wind that affect the player too, and these are the secret to success in the Coral Highlands. How well a monster utilises the wind is everything. It's no surprise then that the flightless Sitsuyaku is slumming it on the ground floor getting harassed by Shamos, the weak small monsters for the area that only it really has to contest as a fellow ground dweller. Palumu is a balloon. It's capable of normal flight, but it can also save energy and just float instead, purely using buoyancy and updrafts to stay airborne. Useful, but floating is the most basic form of flying. It's hard to control altitude and direction when you're just buoyant, so it's no surprise Legiana is the true ruler of the area. Not only an extremely swift and skilled flyer, Legiana's wing membranes, unique among flying wyverns, allow it to loiter on the wind whilst still maintaining supreme control in a way even other flying wyverns can't, as was the intent with Legiana's design, being made to look like an animal that has mastery of the wind, with the membranes being based on the aerons of plane wings, allowing it to hover in place with the updrafts. It's all made clear in the turf war with Palumu. All this is then made clear in the turf war with Palumu, when Legiana washes Palumu around with air currents, dominating and bewildering it before it even brings the hypertrophied talons to bear on the helpless balloon Palumu. The coral itself also plays an important role, and perhaps the focal point of the map is the giant coral stand, almost functioning like a single waterhole in the savannah. This is where life congregates. The Murnos and Palumu feed on the coral eggs, and then Legiana and Sitsi arrive to feed on them. Whilst such interactions can occur at other points in the map too, the reliability of such events in this area make it an ideal spot to start hunting, for either the player or the monsters. The Coral Highlands and the Rotten Vale were tied from the beginning, with the two feeding one another as dead organisms like marine snow fell into the Vale, to continually enrich it with biomass. And the Vale adopted similar themes to the ancient forest, in that it gets continuously less hospitable as the player descends into it, but taken to a greater extent with the actual map itself. The Vale goes from simply appearing hellish to outright damaging the player if they step into the wrong areas, with the acidic water and the miasma of effluvium as the player approaches Valhazak's lair. The acid was also intentional, as this map is meant to invoke the idea of being in a giant stomach, with the fallen biomass getting more and more digested and broken down the deeper you go. The brood of unruly tapeworms that form its guild of monsters too literally absorb the digested nutrients for their fights, Val sucking down the effluvium in the final stage of digestion, whereas Radoban has to replenish its bones in the upper layers as the hunter chops them away. Radoban itself is almost like a giant hairball or owl pellet, clad in indigestible matter and waiting near the esophagus to be hacked up. The effect of the effluvium on other monsters too is noticeable, with Murnos and Gyros being far more hostile to the player under the influence of effluvium. The Veil is also unique in that it actually has the first truly resident elder. Unlike the other more nomadic ones, Val is as well adapted, sedentary and localized to the Veil as any other animal there, being very derived in these habits when compared to the other elders. Rather than being a mega super ecosystem destroyer, Val instead tends to the miasma and keeps everything in balance, really giving it a positive impact. Val's elder gimmick is tied closely to its environment and can't be transported elsewhere, and whilst this ultimately winds up making it the easiest of the world quad, it also winds up making it one of the most unique elders in the category. The rest of the Veil is also structured nicely for the progression through it too. The starting monster Great Gyros maintains some relevance with its paralysis. Whilst it doesn't get a turf war with Odogaron, the near inevitability of it appearing in Odogaron's fight is a nice show don't tell to give the player a hint on how to take down Odogaron if they're struggling later. Odogaron itself strengthens in the Veil. By powering itself up by eating meat, it can effectively start chewing the scenery to boost itself, and also gets a great environmental behaviour stashing a Legiana corpse. Odogaron also acts as the bridge between the two maps, getting into numerous scrapes with monsters in both places, and giving the first Elder normal monster turf war. It also shows the unique adaptations to the Highlands monsters, as it bulldozes over most of them, their abilities rendered useless against it, and it only later meets its match in Legiana. Finally, we come to the Elder's Recess. It'd be wrong to say the ball was dropped here for various reasons, but it can't be denied the Recess doesn't stand anywhere near as strong as the earlier maps. Whilst it's probably the best volcano map in the franchise, that's much like being voted sexiest contender in a blobfish lookalike contest, in that it's something of a hollow victory. The giant crystals are nice, as is the columnar basalt area, and it's worth noting that it did originally start very differently. The initial idea for the Recess was of a much more hellish and barren area, with giant elders and monsters of equivalent strength roaming around against an apocalyptic red sky. It's unknown if these were all intended to be fightable or just background characters, and whilst that does sound pretty extreme, the developers decided they wanted something more like the other maps. They did still firmly decide they wanted the Recess to be the Elder Dragon map, further showing elders are often hard to implement meaningfully with ecology. But they also decided to have some lower ranking monsters in for fear of difficulty and pacing issues. Dodogama itself was pretty much made as a breather in the location to dial the heat down slightly. The returning elders also weren't necessarily brought back for the role in any particular map, but rather because they'd been envisioned in the game from the start, and especially ones with, as they say, a certain flair. Poor Chameleos apparently just lacks the appropriate amounts of razzle-dazzle. Lunastra was added partly just to bring her back, but also to put a new spin on Turf Wars, and to create an incredibly bombastic attack impossible on old hardware. But with that said, their influence did result in which monsters got picked for the Recess especially. The inclusion of a lava zone for Teostra made Lavasioth a natural choice. Uragon originally wasn't intended for World, and was picked for a number of reasons that can also provide an insight into how some monsters do get picked to return for games. Takuda wanted Radoban to be similar to a spinning firewheel yokai, but also realised he initially had something similar in Uragan already, so the idea came to include Uragan, and make them both part of the same clear family. This was combined with the fact that they wanted a monster that moved through the bulk of the map, and was a sleep monster of the appropriate rank, thus Uragan made the cut. And for environmental behaviours, it's still worth noting the map isn't a complete washout. Dodogama still eats the crystals for its attacks, and Uragon gets something of a restoration too. After his flop in Generations Ultimate with no rollable walls in the volcano, and no way to really damage the hunter in the more elevated areas of the maps, Uragon finally gets his rollable walls back, and feels significantly better for it. From a map and ecology and interaction view, it's worth noting this isn't just a recess problem, it's more of a volcano problem. As typically the last area unlocked in the game, volcanoes tend not to bother with a lower rank and file that can build a cohesive map, and so wind up feeling like a top-heavy grab bag of random powerful monsters, because a lot of the time that's exactly what they are. The choice is to either visit the volcano early and fully flesh it out, so far an unused tactic, do the usual method which the Recess did, or the method sometimes used in the earlier titles, of stuffing it with monsters that have questionable relevance there. Time will tell if 6 solves this issue, or if we wind up with more of the same in this regard. With the next big release, Monster Hunter Rise, the developers continued World's trend of open, unsegmented maps. And it'd be wrong to say Rise's maps also aren't detailed, entertaining areas, with endemic life to chase and exploration to do, but it would feel wrong to call them ecosystems, as Rise's biggest thing is that its maps are completely devoted to the player in a way that other games aren't. There are broad chunks of the map that only the player can visit, and the player can travel through essentially any part of the map, as well as having tremendous mobility buffs like running on walls and slingshotting themselves across the terrain. Whilst some of the endemic life remains just that, life there for the player to find and in this case photograph as collectibles, a lot of it is now also weaponized. Much of it is no longer there just as living things to embellish a living area, but is instead in servitude to the hunter to help them deal even more damage. As a result of this successfully met goal, the monsters suffered greatly. It can't be denied this stands in stark contrast to the world goal, of each monster being designed for the topography and geography in mind. Very few have new or interesting environmental moves. Not many really use their surroundings in a fight. There are large swaths of the map completely given over to the hunter rather than the creatures supposed to actually live there. All of this is done in the name of vertical combat, but much like describing using a captive bolt gun on cattle as an active firefight, that's a bit of a generous term. Only one of you actually knows what's going on and has the appropriate tools to fight. Many monsters not only don't use the environments, but have literally no answer for all the vertical movement the hunters now have, except for the final bosses of Nawa and Ibushi, and maybe some beam attacks being angled upwards slightly. The rest can very often feel just like guests in the landscapes they evolved in, and this isn't an unfair assessment. The focus of creating ecosystems is completely absent from Rise, and with it much notion of habitat fidelity. Monsters are often scattered to the four winds with no real concern as to where they end up, and even trying to measure the two games as their own separate entities, it's hard not to be disappointed by this after World. Compare Kushala in World, who wouldn't go to the lava areas of the Recess due to its metal skin, to Tetranodon and Kezu, who ostensibly have to keep their skin moist, cheerfully strutting past open lava flows. Monsters in general have little to do in the maps. Stale carcasses are placed at random for hasty stamina buffs, so no one actually has to hunt, and many general behaviours are gone. As in general, you're not really meant to loiter in Rise's maps. Explore, yes, but never slow down and take things in. Despite their not especially large size and open terrain, we still get the Palamutes to make all of that even faster. You can simply zip to your buffs and down the monster in record time now. And of course, all of this was intentional. Speed and ease of the hunt was a chief goal for Rise. And on top of all of that, wyvern riding was added. A large new part of 5th Gen was monster-monster interactions. World first introduced Turf Wars, and Rise introduced wyvern riding. Both essentially have the same bare-bones concept, using one monster to deliberately damage another. But the differences are perhaps emblematic of the different approaches to World and Rise specifically. Wyvern riding isn't especially interesting to look at. The monster just recycles its normal attack animations, albeit with the player in control of them. And from a lore perspective, it's downright nauseating. that beasts supposedly on par with the gods with 5 generations of build-up can effortlessly be controlled with some glowing fishing twine. But it is convenient and easy to replicate. Wyvern riding can happen with any monster on any map at any time. It's a huge benefit to the player that allows a steamrolling suite of damage numbers for every monster utilised. It can almost let you rack up a conga line of monsters to shorten hunts, and make them a much easier experience. Whereas on the other hand, turf wars are a far more limited experience. The player has a role in triggering them, but nothing else, and they only occur between certain monsters, that, when combined with the stricter map fidelity and the fact not every monster has a turf war with each other, leads to far less of a guarantee of damage or real use to the player. And when they do happen, the damage dealt is limited to just 10% of a monster's health at most. So whilst it still throws a bone to the player, it's not exactly finishing the hunt for you. What they do give is a continuation of looking deeper into the monsters' lives. When bespoke, turf wars show a monster's behaviour, its personality and its role in the ecosystem, often with very characterful animations showcasing their abilities. They serve as a reminder that the player is just a visiting gnat, and that the monsters have a life and rivalries outside of them. So one presents a more tailored experience for immersion in the world focused on the monster, and the other a far more generalised experience to serve the hunter. 5th Gen's take on invaders also somewhat stirred the pot too. Whilst Rises are just generally regarded as ruined, Worlds were something of a mixed bag. Deviljho returned, but had something of a shift from hunter interaction to other monsters, eagerly engaging in and dominating turf wars with many other species. In the developer's keenness to show off his power, he became much less of a hindrance and more of a help depending on the quest. And this was taken to even further levels in Iceborne with Savage Deviljho, that some referred to as the 15th weapon type. Whilst some attention was dialed back to the player, and Deviljho could combine the two with its chew toy animation, using a smaller monster to attack the player, Basiljuice is probably 5th Gen's best invader. Its indiscriminate attacks damage everyone, with multiple small area of effects, and it dive bombs the hunter itself, often resulting in a uniquely chaotic environment that's dangerous to all, but with something of a bias to focusing on the hunter. In many of these regards, big chunks of the differences in map and monster implementation come down to mainline versus portable, and this divide has only increased significantly with 4th Gen onwards. Both have their strengths and weaknesses, and if this video has seemed a glowing review of everything mainline, then it's worth noting they have the latter as well. Perhaps mainline's biggest flaw is that the monsters they make are so tailored to their game of origin that they often feel lackluster outside of them. For a series that generally has relatively reliable returning cast members to pad out rosters, this can make them feel especially flat. Despite both the inevitable yassing and slaying that occurs when old monsters get announced, who can say that Lagarkrus was at its best in Generations Ultimate, or really any of the Tri-originals that made it in too? Similarly, even if things like the Wirebug and such were removed, many World originals ported into Rise had a scarce fraction of their character. Mainline monsters have a very strong introduction, that they can often fail to live up to later in the series, whereas portable monsters, that are often designed to be yeeted over hill and dale with little care, can reliably appear time after again without any past habitat fidelity holding them back. They generally hold their quality a lot better than mainline ones with repeated entries in the series. I also think mainline games can suffer more from a decline in difficulty in 5th Gen, and it's sometimes clear the developers can lose track of that, and that can hamstring certain events. Sitsuyaku gets a bespoke nest of shells to flash the player with, that becomes useless when his frills are broken, which invariably happens before he retreats to said nest. Anjanath was meant to pursue the player, and it was given an exaggerated nose to provide a visual indicator of it actually sniffing them out. But there's rarely reason to flee in the games now. With faster healing and sharpening and the knowledge a monster will change areas at some point, certain aspects like this never really get a chance to come into play. It's the same with Monster Hunter 4, where monsters were given several animations to attack the player over ledges as they fled, that were ultimately never really needed. as the monster was inevitably the one fleeing first, rather than pursuing a fleeing hunter over the terrain for these to be used as intended. Similarly, portable games can often restore jankier or unpleasant monsters. Whilst there's definitely something of a growing trend of people claiming fights are good when they're suddenly easy now, portable games have improved a good few monsters. Rathalos has probably been on a steady upwards trajectory since its initial agonizing creation, and Rise Rathalos is widely regarded as its best yet. World Kushala is regarded as its worst appearance, with Rise as its best too, and it's the same with Sunbreak Seregios and Astalos. But neither of these are set in stone, as World showed it can still reinvigorate old monsters like Diablos and Baroth, and to a lesser extent Uragan, as well as Barioth in Iceborne, that Generations Ultimate failed to do and Rise again after. Plenty of fairly reliable fights have still come from Mainline, and portable games have both dropped the ball on reviving old monsters, as well as creating plenty of original ones that were absolutely dead on arrival. Some are also generally flagging, or on a downwards trajectory. It feels like Nagakuga's only real hope of revitalization is a Mainline base game facelift. If there's been something of a lack of mention of expansions like Iceborne and Sunbreak, then that's deliberate. World set out to make Monster Hunter feel alive with living ecosystems, and Rise set out to make a homage to Japanese mythology and culture. And whatever your thoughts on the respective games, both are generally considered to have succeeded at those aspects at least. And then the expansions came and didn't really share this desire. Whilst such expansions can add content or difficulty that can feel like it was lacking in the base game, ultimately, I find myself a lot less interested in them as time goes on, as that's all they really feel like, content. Just extra raw content spooned in with none of the real design ethos that went into the original. The base game is the passion project, and the expansion is just fanfare. And that's okay to an extent, but can ultimately leave it feeling like a messy or hollow experience for me at least, once the initial hype has worn off. Iceborne's scattering of new monsters ultimately resulted in minimal new ecology, and a lot of less characterful copy and pasted turf wars. Sunbreak's returners generally failed to capture much of a mythological theme, and made the originals stick out in comparison, as well as generally lacking much of a theme overall. A part of this, especially for mainline games, comes from the keenness to have giant multi-biome maps, where everyone can be hunted, starting with the Moga Woods, then the Everwood, Guiding Lands, and to an extent the Citadel. And a lot of the time this never really feels like it's paid off. In most mainline games it only really succeeds to rob many monsters of much of their charm and environmental moves. The Guiding Lands tries to retain some of that, but ultimately winds up as a very squeezed map. I think the Everwood is the best rendition of this. The unpredictability of which biome you'd get, when combined with the expeditions, kept things interesting, and actually having multiple choices rather than squeezing everything into one, solved many issues I have with the other incarnations of this. It'd be tempting to try and say that all of this has some relevance for Monster Hunter 6, and in some ways it does. The knowledge of much of the behind the scenes for World only makes me more excited for it. But really, when people try to predict who's coming back, it really is dependent on the maps they choose to make. Outside of the Wraths, you can't really predict anyone. Monster Hunter 4 lacked a desert map, hence why 4U was effectively Sandborn, with much of the Seregios stuff happening in the desert, along with both Blosswyverns, Cephadrome, and various desert subspecies. World itself lacked a snow map, and those two environments are something many consider a staple for the games. World also added 2 completely new maps not really analogous to others. It's impossible to say what environments they may pick and choose, and in turn what monsters will represent them. Only that if it's anything like World's design ethos, that we're in for a treat. One disparaging thing often said is, who even cares about the ecology of Monster Hunter? And the answer, first and foremost, is the developers. Above all else, from day one. The core theme of the games was intended to be nature above all else. It's becoming increasingly apparent it's easy to make a Monster Hunter clone based on combat. and other purely practical aspects of gameplay. Monster design, ecology, and how these impact their implementation in maps, game, and overall set it apart no matter what detractors say. And ecology is the right word for it. For what is ecology if not the study of how, in an environment, everything is connected? Thanks for watching. And a huge thanks to T Common Shark as well, for providing the walk cycles for the assorted New World monsters. These ones were picked especially for their key relevance to their environments, and T got them done in great time. If you're not already, be sure to follow them as well, for their excellent behavioural snippets that have also enriched past videos. Thanks to the patrons too, especially my top patrons Big Al and Phenomenon for their continuing support of the channel, as well as K Sandom, Erengar Steiny, Sassy Birdo, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Seth Fake Last Name, Zacer, Carousel, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakuhatsu Bakumatsu for their kindness as well. If you're interested in supporting the channel yourself too, there's a link to the Patreon and any amount is always appreciated. Liking, subscribing and sharing are also a big help too. Do let me know your thoughts on this video. Reading this script back, it's hard to tell if this was a worthwhile video or even more pretentious waffle than the usual content, just spelling out the obvious. In hindsight, it does feel like this really should have preceded the design video, and is really the more relevant topic than just talking about monsters in isolation. Oh well, we live and learn. Next time will be a non-Monster Hunter video, and then back to the usual species profile content. Hopefully I'll see you there for them.